Hi everyone, my name is Matt Riemland. I'm originally from the USA, and in October of this year I started as an assistant professor in the Department of English Studies here at SWPS University in Warsaw. I have an academic background in translation and sociolinguistics, and I'm particularly interested in the ethical dimensions as well as the social and even environmental impacts of AI technologies, which is what I'm going to be talking about with you today. So before we talk about what kind of ethical problems there are with respect to artificial intelligence and what impacts they might have on language professionals, we should talk about the history of AI development, at least in the recent history. This current wave of AI hype started in late 2022 with the release of Chat-GPT, and already back then there was a mixture of excitement as well as panic. Chat-GPT is what we call a large language model, or LLM, and it's one of the most prominent, well-known forms of AI. Shortly after the release of Chat-GPT, the public's imagination started to run away. Many prominent scientists and tech leaders signed an open letter declaring the risk of extinction posed by AI. Among those signatories were people like Bill Gates and Sam Altman, who is in charge of the company OpenAI, who made ChatGPT. Geoffrey Hinton, sometimes referred to as the godfather of AI, just recently received a Nobel Prize for his work on artificial intelligence, and he has been quite outspoken about his fear of AI becoming too powerful to control. Earlier this year, a U.S. government commission report also raised fears of the threat of an emerging artificial general intelligence, AGI, which is something that's spoken about in the media quite a lot, that could develop supposedly independent, complex reasoning skills to match those of humans. So now this is perceived to be a national security threat. Clearly, artificial intelligence has been framed as this all-powerful technology that's supposedly going to transform the world, and particularly the global economy, our everyday lives. And against all this background, I'd like to actually clarify what AI is and give a brief overview of how it works. Kate Crawford is an expert on the ethics of artificial intelligence, and she makes an important distinction that I think will help clarify things up for us. She says, it's worth noting that the term artificial intelligence can create discomfort in the computer science community. The phrase has moved in and out of fashion over the decades and is used more in marketing than by researchers. Machine learning is more commonly used in the technical literature. So this is important to keep in mind that artificial intelligence has mostly come into the public perception as a marketing term rather than a technical term. And two forms of artificial intelligence that I'd like to talk about in particular today are large language models like ChatGPT, already mentioned, as well as neural machine translation, things like DeepL and Google Translate. So now it'd be helpful to talk about how large language models actually produce the language that we're seeing. Large language models, or LLMs, like ChatGPT, simply aim to mimic or reproduce human-like text by estimating the likelihood that a particular word will appear next, given the text that has come before. LLMs develop this capability during their training stage by constructing a highly complex probability model based on enormous amounts of text of the sequential relationships between words. So that essentially means that the large language models are merely reflecting a mathematical representation of language rather than language as we would use in the human sense of the term. So neural machine translation, or NMT, systems like DeepL and Google Translate, which people are very familiar with, they work in a similar manner. These AI translation models are trained using large quantities of sample translations between the selected languages. So the AI translation model then creates a mathematical representation of the relationships between all words in the sample translations, and then uses that same mathematical representation to translate any future inputs given to it by the user. So while these AI models are very sophisticated, the basic thing you have to understand is that they depend on seeing many, many examples of the way a task is performed in order to perform it themselves. Essentially, AI models need to be exposed to massive sets of data in their initial training phases. But beyond data, we can generally say there are two other main factors that go into making AI possible, making it operate. In addition to data, AI models need huge amounts of compute. The general term for the sophisticated infrastructure of hardware and software that generates a high level of computational processing power. But AI also needs additional labor, labor in many forms. Workers frequently need to correct AI outputs and teach it additional patterns that the model has not encoded into its underlying mathematical representation of the language it's trying to mimic. And when we take a closer look at each of these factors necessary for creating and operating AI models, we start to see some serious ethical issues and harms to various communities and groups. So you might be wondering where OpenAI acquired all the training data for Chat-GPT. We already know that AI models need massive sets of training data in order to function effectively. It turns out that the company, OpenAI, took text from a wide variety of available sources on the internet, which included things like online articles from professional journalists, open user forums like Reddit, and even copyrighted digital books from well-known authors. All of this seems to have happened without any consent or explicit or implicit from the original creators of this data, whether it's the writers or the users themselves. There's currently an ongoing lawsuit by the New York Times suing OpenAI for using its archive of historical newspapers in order to train Chat-GPT. Now, the company OpenAI is then using all this data without the original creator's consent or permission to make their own model and essentially profit from it. Compute is another major factor in making AI operate. It's mostly only big tech companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft who have the available resources and infrastructures necessary to train and operate AI models efficiently. So most companies developing AI tools rely on those companies' data centers. Data centers require a ton of energy in order to train and operate AI models. And when local energy grids where these data centers are located use fossil fuels like natural gas or coal to produce energy, that creates a lot of carbon emissions. So as a result, many big tech companies investing in AI and data centers are now missing their sustainability goals as a result from the increased carbon emissions from AI systems specifically. And finally, even though we tend to think of AI as completely automated and self-sufficient, there's quite a bit of hidden labor needed to make AI operate effectively. For example, in Chat-GPT's early stages, it was producing very inappropriate, harmful language. So the company needed to hire workers to experiment with the tool, review its outputs, label the harmful content so that the developers could implement safeguards in the system to prevent it from showing that kind of text to users. And of course, the company wanted to do this as cheaply as possible, so they hired workers in Kenya to do it for $2 per hour. So now that we have a bit of background context about the processes and resources needed for AI models like Chat-GPT to work, we can revisit the pressing question: does AI think? Some people claim that reasoning and intelligence are things that emerge out of AI models when they are exposed to enough high-quality training data. But ultimately, the models are still only using their underlying mathematical processes to predict likely or plausible seeming sequences of words based on their training data, based on prompts or inputs from the user themselves. So whenever an LLM's statements are true or they seem reasonable to us, it's simply because their underlying mathematical representation has produced a sequence of words that just happens to reflect a true statement by total coincidence or chance. And although researchers, journalists, and many industry professionals use metaphors to describe AI models as learning or thinking, in human terms, AI doesn't really work like the human brain. In fact, the human brain is much more complicated than AI. There's a lot more types of inputs that go into thinking than language alone. As humans, we interact with our environments in a much more complex manner, and our use of language is much more sophisticated than merely a system of probabilities and mathematical relationships between words, which ultimately is just what AI is. Not to mention the overwhelming majority of language-based AI tools focus on English and perform much better for languages like English and more globally dominant languages, because smaller languages have far less available training data with which an AI model can be trained and improved. And while Chat-GPT can interface in many different languages, reportedly 93% of its training data, the training data for GPT-3, the model that created so much hype back in late 2022, 93% of that training data was in English. And without going into too many precise technical details, I can tell you that LLMs combine languages with each other, mix them with each other into the same model so that they all kind of learn from each other, so to speak. And that basically means that the model might begin to make certain patterns or vocabulary in Polish, for example, look more like the patterns of grammar and vocabulary in English because there's an imbalance of training data. And not to mention the model will reflect any other ideological biases implicit in its training data with regards to things like race or gender. So no, ultimately, AI does not think. It merely mimics human language by creating a mathematical representation of language based on the probabilities of sequences of words. So this begs the question then why there's so much hype around AI's ability to think. We've all had AI marketing and fantasies and predictions thrown into our face over the past couple of years, and it's helpful to understand the economic forces behind all this hype. And after ChatGPT was released, many other tech companies rushed in to develop their own state-of-the-art AI models, fearing that they would fall behind if they didn't. This led to huge investments in AI technologies from the private financial sector as well as governments around the world. And now, just a couple years after this initial wave of AI hype began, a lot of investors are looking back at these technologies and realizing that they aren't generating nearly the levels of profits that they originally anticipated, so they're fearing that they won't get the kind of returns on their original investments that they predicted. But still, AI technologies are having quite a negative impact on language professionals like writers and translators, because companies are using language AI for creative work like, Frame 20. But still, AI technologies are having quite a negative impact on language professionals. Companies have turned to using language AI for creative work like translation or writing for marketing public relation materials, and then simply asking those creative professionals who would have done the work in the first place to merely clean up or edit the AI outputs for much lower pay. So the creative professionals are getting paid way less to simply serve as an assistant to the AI tool that hasn't quite replaced them, but has devalued their labor in a significant way. So why should English students care about all this? Well, if you're investing in an education in language and you want to take these skills that you learn in your English program and go out into the world and be a successful worker, someone who's compensated fairly for your labor, it should concern you that these tools are taking over the data from the internet, from authors, from translators, and using that to devalue the work that you will be doing in the future, in addition to all these other social and even environmental harms of the infrastructures needed to power these very complex technologies. So that's a pretty basic overview of some of the primary ethical concerns when it comes to these technologies like large language models or neural machine translation, and how we might be able to take a more critical perspective towards AI tools moving forward. I hope you've learned a little bit and gained some insights from this talk, and I really appreciate you tuning in. Here are a few of the references that I alluded to in my presentation, as well as a couple recommendations for podcasts offering a very critical and entertaining perspective on the AI industry. Those are Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, hosted by Professor Emily M. Bender and Dr. Alex Hanna, as well as the podcast The Data Fix by Mel Hogan. So that's it for my presentation. I really appreciate you tuning in once again. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or want to discuss anything further. Thanks.